Arthur Schopenhauer, the philosopher who saw life through the lens of suffering, once said that life is fundamentally a misery that we're forced to endure. His bleak view of existence challenges the optimism of many philosophers and offers a darker, more cynical perspective on human nature. In this video, we will dive into Schopenhauer's philosophy to explore his profound insights into the nature of life, suffering, and death. Buckle up, because we're about to take a deep dive into the pessimistic heart of one of history's most misunderstood thinkers. Schopenhauer's philosophy is anchored in his concept of the will, an unrelenting force that drives all living beings. This will is not a conscious desire or intention, but rather an unconscious blind force that propels all actions and existence. It manifests in everything, from the smallest particle of matter to the grandest aspirations of human beings. It is the foundation of life, but it is also the source of endless suffering. For Schopenhauer, the will is the root cause of all human misery because it is insatiable. No matter how much we strive for, how many desires we fulfill, there is always another desire to take its place. Satisfaction is always fleeting and temporary, while dissatisfaction is constant. This constant cycle of desire and dissatisfaction traps us in a perpetual state of suffering. Even when we achieve something we think we want, it does not bring the lasting contentment we expect. Instead, the fulfillment of one desire only leads to the emergence of another. Our lives are thus consumed by the pursuit of goals that ultimately offer no real satisfaction or peace. The will to live is so strong that it compels us to keep going despite the futility of our desires. Schopenhauer argued that the very nature of life itself is a constant battle between what we want and the harsh reality that we cannot have everything we desire. Every moment of joy is temporary, overshadowed by the overwhelming realization that our needs will never truly be fulfilled. As soon as one desire is satisfied, the will immediately shifts to another, keeping us trapped in an endless cycle of striving and discontent. This cycle, according to Schopenhauer, is the essence of human existence, and it is the source of the suffering that defines our lives. The will is not limited to just human beings. It extends to all forms of life. It is a force that drives animals, plants, and even inanimate matter. Schopenhauer believed that all life is driven by the same underlying force, the will, because it is this will that gives rise to the appearance of individuality. The desire to live and to perpetuate life is a fundamental aspect of existence itself. But this very drive is what creates suffering. Every living creature must endure pain and hardship as it strives to survive, grow, and reproduce. Even when an individual manages to escape some of the pain or discomfort of life, it is only temporary. The constant striving for survival and growth ensures that life will always be marked by suffering. Schopenhauer's philosophy of the will brings us to the realization that there is no lasting happiness in life, only fleeting moments of relief. We are locked in a perpetual cycle of desire, striving for satisfaction, only to find that it never truly comes. It is this endless, unconscious drive that Schopenhauer argues is the root of all suffering. Life, for him, is a misery, a never-ending struggle to fulfill desires that can never truly be satisfied. For Schopenhauer, suffering is the very essence of life. The world is filled with pain, and even the most fleeting moments of joy are marked by the inevitable return of suffering, whether it's physical pain, emotional agony, or the existential torment of knowing that we are bound to suffer. Schopenhauer argued that life is fundamentally miserable. Even when we think we've found happiness, it is always temporary. And eventually, we are confronted with the harsh reality of life's inherent misery. The happiness we experience is often nothing more than the temporary cessation of suffering, a brief respite before the next wave of pain crashes upon us. Schopenhauer saw suffering as an intrinsic part of human experience, one that cannot be avoided or escaped. He argued that from the moment we are born, we are doomed to experience pain, whether it is physical or emotional. Our bodies are frail and prone to illness, and our minds are vulnerable to despair, anxiety, and existential crisis. The very nature of human existence guarantees that suffering will be a constant companion throughout our lives, and as we age, the suffering only intensifies. Our physical bodies deteriorate, and we become increasingly aware of our mortality. As we lose our youth, our health, and our vitality, we are forced to confront the reality of our own inevitable death. But it is not just physical suffering that defines human existence. Schopenhauer believed that psychological suffering, brought on by our desires, disappointments, and anxieties, is just as real, if not more so, than the pain of the body. The human mind is plagued by countless desires, and it is the failure to satisfy these desires that causes psychological torment. We crave love, success, and fulfillment. But even when we achieve these things, they often fail to bring the lasting happiness we expect. Instead, they are followed by new desires, new frustrations, and new fears. This cycle of wanting and failing to achieve satisfaction is the source of much of the mental anguish that we experience throughout our lives. Moreover, the awareness of the transience of life adds to this suffering. We know that every pleasure we experience is fleeting and that nothing lasts forever. The awareness of our own mortality, of the fact that we will eventually die and be forgotten, casts a shadow over everything we do. Even when we find joy in life, there is always the underlying realization that it will not last. The inevitability of death makes all our achievements seem insignificant. And it's this existential awareness that adds an additional layer of suffering to human experience. Schopenhauer saw this suffering as an inescapable part of life. It is not something we can avoid or overcome, but something we must endure. This realization can be profoundly disheartening, and it can make life feel like an endless cycle of pain and frustration. But for Schopenhauer, it was also a source of insight. In acknowledging the inherent misery of existence, we can begin to understand the true nature of life. The acceptance of suffering, rather than its denial or avoidance, can lead to a deeper understanding of ourselves and the world around us. By confronting the reality of suffering head-on, we can gain a sense of clarity and peace that comes from accepting life as it is, rather than constantly striving for something that may never come. Suffering, for Schopenhauer, is not just a byproduct of life, it is life itself. Our desires, our striving, and our awareness of our own mortality are all integral aspects of the human condition. And it is only by confronting this reality that we can begin to understand the true nature of existence. In this sense, Schopenhauer's philosophy offers a profound, if bleak, insight into the human experience. Life is not about seeking happiness or fulfillment, but about coming to terms with the suffering that is inevitable. Only then can we find a sense of peace in the face of life's inherent misery. Despite his overwhelmingly pessimistic view of life, Schopenhauer did not entirely resign himself to despair. He proposed that there is a way to momentarily escape the ceaseless cycle of suffering and desire that defines our existence through art and aesthetic experience. Schopenhauer believed that art provided us with a unique form of transcendence, offering a brief but powerful respite from the pain and torment of our daily lives. It was in the act of engaging with art that individuals could temporarily step outside the relentless will, the insatiable drive for satisfaction, and experience a kind of detachment from the world. For Schopenhauer, art allowed us to see the world not as a battleground of desires and struggles, but as a realm of pure contemplation. When we experience art in its truest form, we momentarily become free from the tyranny of the will. Rather than being consumed by our desires, anxieties, and goals, we are able to focus on the artwork itself, the form, the beauty, and the deeper truths it reveals. This experience, according to Schopenhauer, offers us a glimpse of a higher state of being, a state in which we are not ruled by the demands of the will, but are instead free to experience the world as it truly is, in its purest form. Schopenhauer was particularly drawn to music as the highest form of art, and he believed that it was the most direct way to express the essence of the will. Music, unlike other forms of art, bypasses the intellect and speaks directly to the emotions and the unconscious mind. It has the power to evoke deep, often ineffable feelings within us, providing a kind of emotional release that other art forms cannot. Music, for Schopenhauer, was the purest expression of the underlying reality of the will, revealing the fundamental rhythms and forces that drive the world. In music, he saw a mirror of the will itself, chaotic, tumultuous, and yet deeply expressive of the human condition. It is in music that we can most clearly perceive the inner workings of existence and our own struggles with the forces that shape our lives. But Schopenhauer also recognized the value of other art forms, particularly those that allow us to experience the world from a more detached perspective. Painting, sculpture, and literature, he believed, all had the power to offer us moments of transcendence. These art forms allow us to see the world through the eyes of the artist, offering new perspectives and insights that we might otherwise overlook. Through visual art, we can appreciate the harmony and beauty of nature, as well as the deeper metaphysical truths that lie beneath the surface of everyday life. Literature, too, provides us with a way to explore the human condition from different angles, allowing us to confront the complexities of existence in a more indirect way. For Schopenhauer, the key to the aesthetic experience was the ability to step outside oneself and the ceaseless demands of the will. Art allows us to take a break from the grind of daily life, to stop chasing after fleeting pleasures and goals, and instead simply be present with the work of art. This form of contemplation offers us a rare moment of freedom from the suffering that defines our existence. In these moments, we are no longer consumed by our desires or anxieties. Instead, we are able to experience the world as it is, without the usual distortions of the will. Schopenhauer's view of art and aesthetic experience was not merely an intellectual exercise. It had deep implications for how we live our lives. If we can learn to engage with art in a way that allows us to step outside the ego and the demands of the will, we may be able to carry some of that peace and clarity into our everyday lives. In this sense, art becomes not just a source of temporary escape, but a potential tool for living a more thoughtful and reflective life. By immersing ourselves in the contemplation of beauty and form, we may begin to cultivate a greater sense of inner peace, even in the midst of life's inevitable suffering. Moreover, Schopenhauer believed that art had the potential to unite us with others in a shared experience of beauty and truth. In a world where we are often isolated by our own desires and struggles, art offers a rare opportunity to connect with something greater than ourselves. Through art, we can transcend our individual egos and experience a sense of oneness with the artist, the work, and even with other viewers or listeners. This sense of unity, Schopenhauer argued, is one of the greatest gifts that art can offer us. It reminds us that, despite the suffering that pervades our lives, there are moments when we can experience a deeper connection to the world and to each other. In his broader philosophy, Schopenhauer suggested that aesthetic contemplation could offer a path to inner peace and tranquility. By cultivating a deep appreciation for art, we can begin to detach ourselves from the constant demands of the will. In doing so, we may be able to reduce the psychological suffering that results from our insatiable desires. The ability to appreciate art, to engage with it on a deeper level, is therefore a vital tool for finding some semblance of peace in a world that is otherwise dominated by suffering. Schopenhauer's view of art also intersects with his ethical philosophy. He believed that one of the keys to reducing suffering in the world was through compassion. Art, by offering us moments of insight into the suffering and beauty of the human condition, can cultivate a sense of empathy and compassion for others. By engaging with art, we can gain a deeper understanding of the struggles and joys of those around us, leading us to act with greater kindness and awareness. Through the shared experience of beauty and contemplation, we are reminded of our common humanity, and this can motivate us to alleviate the suffering of others. However, Schopenhauer did not believe that art could provide a permanent solution to the problems of life. While it offers us a temporary escape from suffering, it cannot eliminate the fundamental misery of existence. Even the greatest works of art are fleeting, and the moment of transcendence they provide is always short-lived. Nonetheless, Schopenhauer argued that the value of art lies in its ability to provide us with glimpses of a higher state of being. Moments when we are able to transcend the will and experience the world in a purer, more detached form. These moments, though brief, offer us a taste of freedom from the constant cycle of desire and suffering that characterizes our lives. Art, for Schopenhauer, serves as both a refuge and a reminder. It provides a temporary respite from the harshness of life, but it also reveals to us the deeper truths about existence. Through art, we can glimpse the beauty and truth that lie beyond the realm of desire, offering us a way to understand and experience life in a more profound way. It is in these moments of aesthetic contemplation that we find our most profound freedom, not from the world itself, but from the relentless demands of the will. Despite Schopenhauer's deeply pessimistic worldview, he did not wholly resign himself to a life of despair. He saw compassion as one of the few virtues that could offer a semblance of meaning and relief amid life's inherent suffering. Compassion, in Schopenhauer's view, is the moral response to the fundamental truth that all beings are suffering, and it is through recognizing the shared nature of suffering that we can transcend the self-centered striving that defines human existence. It is this very recognition of the universality of suffering that fosters a sense of empathy and the desire to alleviate the pain of others, offering a potential antidote to the despair that permeates life. Schopenhauer's view of compassion is deeply connected to his concept of the will. The will, in his philosophy, is an unconscious force that drives all living beings. It compels us to strive for desires and goals, but in doing so, it also leads to suffering. The will is inherently selfish, as it is the engine behind the individual's striving for self-preservation, fulfillment, and personal gain. It is the force that keeps us locked in the cycle of desire, frustration, and suffering. But compassion, Schopenhauer argued, is the one way in which we can transcend the ego and the demands of the will. Through compassion, we can recognize the suffering of others as our own, and, in doing so, dissolve the boundaries between ourselves and others. Compassion allows us to see beyond the individual will and to connect with the shared experience of suffering that binds all living beings together. Schopenhauer believed that genuine compassion involves recognizing the suffering of others without the interference of self-interest. When we experience compassion, we are not thinking about how the suffering of others might affect us or what we might gain from alleviating their pain. Instead, we are acting out of a genuine concern for their well-being, motivated by the understanding that their suffering is no different from our own. This form of compassion is not just a moral duty, but a deeper existential recognition of the interconnectedness of all life. To help another in their suffering is, in a sense, to help ourselves, as we are all part of the same web of existence, all bound by the same will and the same fate. The development of compassion requires a shift in perspective, one that moves away from a focus on the individual's desires and towards a broader understanding of the shared nature of suffering. Schopenhauer suggested that one of the ways to cultivate this compassion is through a deep awareness of the transience of life and the inevitability of suffering. When we understand that suffering is a universal condition, we are more likely to empathize with others and recognize their pain as our own. This awareness of the fragility of life makes us more sensitive to the pain of others, and it motivates us to act in ways that alleviate that suffering. One of the key aspects of compassion in Schopenhauer's philosophy is that it allows us to move beyond the self-centered striving that characterizes much of human existence. The will, as Schopenhauer understood it, is the force that drives individuals to pursue their own desires and goals, often at the expense of others. It keeps us focused on our own personal needs and wants, leading to a life of isolation and competition. Compassion, on the other hand, allows us to step outside of the ego and recognize that our own suffering is not unique. It is part of the larger human condition. This realization can soften the sharp edges of our self-interest and make us more inclined to act for the benefit of others. By recognizing the suffering of others as our own, we begin to dissolve the boundaries between the self and the other, creating a sense of unity and solidarity. However, Schopenhauer did not view compassion as a cure-all for the suffering that defines human existence. Compassion, while valuable, is not enough to eliminate the inherent misery of life. Schopenhauer was deeply skeptical of the idea that human beings could ever create a utopia of happiness and peace. He argued that suffering is an intrinsic part of life, and no amount of compassion can erase this fact. Nonetheless, compassion provides a temporary relief from the harshness of existence. By helping others alleviate their suffering, we create a sense of connection and meaning in a world that often seems devoid of both. Compassion offers us a way to act morally and ethically, despite the fact that we cannot escape the fundamental truth of suffering. Schopenhauer also believed that compassion has a unique moral value in that it is not based on the pursuit of personal gain or reward. Unlike other virtues such as justice or courage, which are often tied to self-interest or the desire for recognition, compassion is a purely selfless virtue. It is the one moral act that arises from a recognition of our shared suffering and our inherent interconnectedness. In a world where much of human behavior is driven by the will to satisfy personal desires and ambitions, compassion is a rare and valuable expression of altruism. It is an act that transcends the self and seeks to alleviate the suffering of others, not for any personal benefit, but simply because it is the right thing to do. Schopenhauer's emphasis on compassion also has an important ethical dimension. He believed that the recognition of the suffering of others should guide our actions in the world. While we cannot eliminate suffering entirely, we can make choices that reduce the suffering of others and promote greater kindness and understanding. Compassion, in this sense, is not just a passive emotion, but an active force that compels us to take action in ways that are beneficial to others. It motivates us to act morally and ethically, not out of a sense of duty or obligation, but out of a genuine concern for the well-being of others. But Schopenhauer also recognized the limitations of compassion. While it allows us to connect with others and alleviate their suffering in small ways, it cannot solve the larger problem of life's inherent misery. Suffering, for Schopenhauer, is an inescapable fact of existence, and no amount of compassion can change this. What compassion does, however, is provide a temporary reprieve from the suffering that defines life. It offers us a way to cope with the pain of existence by connecting us to others and reminding us that we are not alone in our struggles. Compassion is an acknowledgement of the shared nature of suffering, and it gives us a sense of purpose and meaning in a world that often feels devoid of both. Schopenhauer's ethical vision, shaped by his understanding of compassion, was therefore a profoundly humanistic one. He believed that we should seek to alleviate the suffering of others, not because it will lead to some higher spiritual reward, or because it will make us feel good about ourselves, but because it is the right thing to do in a world where suffering is inevitable. Compassion, in this sense, is not just an act of kindness. It is an acknowledgement of the harsh reality of existence and an attempt to make life a little more bearable for those around us. While Schopenhauer's philosophy can appear grim and bleak, his emphasis on compassion provides a thread of hope in an otherwise dark worldview. It is through compassion that we can create meaning in a life that is otherwise marked by suffering and futility. By recognizing the shared nature of suffering and acting to alleviate it, we transcend the ego and the individual will, finding solace in the understanding that we are all bound by the same fate. Compassion, then, is not just a moral response to suffering. It is a way of finding meaning and connection in a world that offers little of either. Through compassion, we may find a way to live with purpose, even in the face of life's inherent misery. Schopenhauer's philosophy may seem inherently bleak, but it provides an unusual pathway for understanding and, in some sense, coping with life's essential misery. The culmination of his philosophy is not necessarily a life of resignation or passivity, but one that advocates for a form of acceptance, an understanding of life as it truly is, rather than as we might wish it to be. This acceptance does not lead to complete happiness, but rather to a profound form of peace and freedom from the endless striving that defines human existence. Schopenhauer argued that while the will itself cannot be eradicated, the suffering it causes can be mitigated through a change in how we engage with life. The most radical aspect of Schopenhauer's ethical outlook was his assertion that the greatest possible form of freedom lies in renouncing the will, recognizing that the endless striving for personal desires, goals, and achievements only perpetuates the cycle of suffering. According to Schopenhauer, the will is fundamentally irrational. It is an unconscious drive that propels us toward goals we think will fulfill us. Yet, the satisfaction of any one goal always leads to the desire for another, keeping us forever trapped in a cycle of craving and dissatisfaction. The very essence of life, for Schopenhauer, is this struggle, the will striving, constantly pulling us towards things we believe will bring us happiness, but which always fall short of providing lasting fulfillment. However, Schopenhauer believed that freedom from this suffering could be achieved through renunciation of the will, what he called denial of the will. This is not the same as an outright rejection of life itself, nor does it mean we must withdraw from the world and live in total asceticism. Rather, it is an attitude of non-attachment to the constant desires that propel us forward. It is a recognition that life's pursuits are ultimately futile in providing lasting satisfaction and a conscious choice to relinquish our attachment to the transient goals we continually set for ourselves. Through this renunciation, we do not escape suffering altogether, but we can learn to reduce the intensity of our desires and, therefore, the suffering they cause. This denial of the will allows us to see the world from a different perspective. When we stop living in constant pursuit of goals, we are no longer caught in the incessant cycle of striving. Instead of chasing after things that ultimately do not fulfill us, we begin to experience life in its present form, without the need for it to be anything other than what it is. This is the key to Schopenhauer's understanding of human freedom, not the absence of suffering, but the ability to experience the world without being constantly enslaved by the will's insatiable drive. For Schopenhauer, this denial of the will is not simply a form of resignation to life's inherent misery, but rather a positive affirmation of life. By stepping back from the constant demands of desire and striving, we are able to experience life more fully in the moment. We no longer view life through the lens of personal goals or expectations, but instead as a world full of experiences that are valuable in their own right. In this sense, renouncing the will allows us to discover a kind of peace that is independent of the external world and its ever-changing circumstances. We can find contentment, not in the satisfaction of our desires, but in simply being alive, in existing without the need to be anything other than what we are. Schopenhauer was acutely aware of the fact that the denial of the will is not an easy path to follow. It requires a profound shift in consciousness, a radical reevaluation of how we approach life and its challenges. The will is a powerful force, and to renounce it is to swim against the current of human nature itself. Our instincts and impulses push us to pursue more, to achieve more, to gather more wealth, success, and status. The world, too, encourages us to do so, reinforcing the idea that fulfillment lies in the acquisition of things, whether material or abstract. To renounce this relentless drive is to go against both societal expectations and biological impulses. Yet, Schopenhauer argued, it is through this act of renunciation that we can begin to see the world more clearly, free from the distortions created by the will's ceaseless demands. This process of renunciation also involves a shift in our attitude towards suffering. Instead of seeing suffering as something to be avoided or eliminated, Schopenhauer suggested that we embrace it as an inescapable part of life. Suffering, for him, is not something that can be overcome or transcended entirely, but something we must learn to accept. The pursuit of happiness through the avoidance of pain, the seeking of pleasure as a way to counterbalance suffering, only perpetuates the cycle. Suffering, in Schopenhauer's view, is not just an unfortunate byproduct of life. It is life itself, the very force that drives us forward, whether in pursuit of goals or in our efforts to avoid pain. Acceptance of this suffering, rather than fighting it, is the key to finding peace. This acceptance of suffering is not a call for passivity or apathy. Schopenhauer's philosophy does not advocate for simply surrendering to fate or withdrawing from the world. Instead, it is about a deeper understanding of the world as it is. When we cease to fight against the natural course of things, we are able to approach life more serenely, rather than constantly striving to fulfill desires that ultimately offer no lasting satisfaction. We begin to see the world as a place of beauty and meaning in itself. We find that fulfillment does not lie in achieving our desires, but in experiencing life in its raw, unadulterated form. In many ways, Schopenhauer's philosophy of renunciation aligns with aspects of Eastern thought, particularly Buddhism, which also teaches that suffering is an inescapable aspect of life, and that the cessation of suffering comes through detachment from desires. Schopenhauer was deeply influenced by Eastern philosophy, particularly by the teachings of the Buddha, and he saw parallels between his own philosophy and the concepts of nirvana and the cessation of desire. However, Schopenhauer's view was not one of complete withdrawal from life. It was an acceptance of the world as it is, without the need for it to conform to our personal expectations or desires. Through the renunciation of the will, Schopenhauer believed that we could cultivate a deeper sense of compassion for others. As our desires lessen and we become less attached to our own self-interest, we begin to understand the suffering of others more clearly. This deeper sense of empathy allows us to act with greater kindness, compassion, and generosity, motivated not by a desire for personal gain, but by the recognition of the shared nature of human suffering. In this way, the renunciation of the will does not lead to isolation or indifference, but rather to a greater sense of connection to others and to the world. Ultimately, Schopenhauer's idea of renouncing the will does not promise a life without suffering. It is not a path to utopia or happiness in the conventional sense, but it does offer a way to live with a deeper sense of peace, accepting the inherent misery of existence while learning to disengage from the relentless cycle of desire that causes so much pain. By letting go of the need to constantly strive, we free ourselves from the exhausting pursuit of goals that offer only temporary satisfaction. And we open ourselves to experiencing life in its simplest, most profound form. Through this acceptance, Schopenhauer believed, we can find a form of peace that transcends the suffering that marks our existence.